Hello and welcome to the Public Health Insight Podcast. Today we're going to be having a special episode where we're going to be talking about public health interview questions and how to answer them. And today I have three special guests, Purva, Bindra, and Gordon.
You're listening to the Public Health Insight Podcast, your go-to space for all things public health and global health, from the Sustainable Development Goals to the social determinants of health, as well as interesting dialogues about the diverse career opportunities that exist in these fields. Remember to subscribe to the podcast and leave us a rating on Apple Podcasts and Spotify so other people like you can benefit from our content.
Before we move on, it is important to note that the views expressed in this podcast are our own and do not necessarily represent any of the agencies or organizations we work for or are affiliated with.
Thanks, LaShawn. And in this episode, we're going to talk about unlocking the art of answering interview questions by exploring why they're asking these questions in the first place. And the best place to start this conversation is, how do you typically prepare for that interview? LaShawn, you get the email or call, you get called in for an interview. What's the first thing you do next?
Call Gordon and tell him I got the interview.
Yeah, sounds right. Sounds about right.
That's the truth. So in terms of preparation, I usually break it down into, let's say, three different parts. The first part, learning more about the organization and how it's relevant to the position that you'll be doing. Number two, look at the job posting and dissect the specifics of it, and we'll get into that more. But then the third one is putting yourself in the interview situation and anticipating the types of questions that'll be asked. And based on that, think about how your experiences to date are applicable to those questions and how you could embed it in those potential questions.
Okay. So, Bindra, for interviews, I know there's a lot of talk about the different types of questions that are asked. How do you feel about that? The behavioral, situational questions, the questions related to the skills of the job posting, and then sort of what is your approach to answering those questions? Do you have a framework you want to share? You just go in and wing it like LaShawn?
I don't think I can just wing it like LaShawn. I don't have those skills, unfortunately. But there's definitely different approaches to answering questions. I think for me, I really want to first know what type of interview it will be, because I've had different experiences. It's either a full-on, like, very technical interview. They don't really want to know much about you, your personality, your fit with the organization, but more so, do you have the skills required? But then there's other interviews I've had where it's mostly they just want to get to know you as a person and whether you'll fit in, and just kind of knowing more about your previous experience and how you portray yourself to the organization in that way. So I think first knowing like what type of questions you'll anticipate will really help with that preparation piece. And so if, let's say, it's supposed to be a technical, maybe behavioral interview, then one method I use is definitely the STAR approach. So let me try to remember what that stands for. It's situation, action,
No. Situation, task, action, result.
Yeah,
I think.
there you go. Situation, task, action, result. And that's honestly, I think, the best way to approach any question that asks you, that's scenario based, right? So if it asks you about, hey, tell me about a time where, you did X, Y, Z, how did you approach that situation? What was your take on it? You kind of go through the different steps using that method. And that always really works for me because you're able to give a really thorough answer and make sure you cover all your bases. So I use kind of that approach for any behavioral interview. But when it comes more to, preparing myself for any interview in general, I think I tend to focus more on recollecting my experiences and really going back to, okay, what are the experiences I've had and how can I talk about myself in a way that makes sure I'm a great fit for this organization? I try to really focus on more myself versus the organization. I know that's the opposite of what LaShawn said, but I think I want to make sure that I'm giving the best impression as possible. So I make sure that I know about myself, because even if you might know, about yourself, you're not able to portray it in the best way during the interview, then that can really screw you up. So that's kind of the approach I take.
Know yourself.
Know yourself. So you get to the interview now, and one of the first questions that tends to get asked is, tell me about yourself. Or, some people start talking about their dogs, their family, where they came from. Purva, what do we really mean, or what do interviewers want, I should say, when they're asking the question, tell me about yourself? And what's your approach to that type of question?
Yeah, definitely don't regurgitate your resume. So don't say, I graduated in this degree at this year, and then I did this. Like, say that, but in a more general form, such as I have a background in so, and then explain and talk about your experiences and how they may have evolved you and made you the career professional you are now. Things that aren't in your resume and aren't in your cover letter. They'll show you what type of professional you are and what type of person you are. And I think if you kind of cover both bases, then it may hit on the part where Binder was talking about, where you can talk about your technical skills, but then you can also talk about who you are as a person if they're also looking for a personality fit within the current team that they have. For this question, I always have it pre-prepared. Like, there is almost like a script that I write up and I practice. It's something that every single interview is going to ask. They may not always ask it as, tell me about yourself. They might ask it like, why are you the best candidate for the job? Or talk about skills and responsibilities that, you've done right now or have done previously that will be really good for this position. So those type of questions are all hitting that same idea about asking who you are as a professional, how do you perform, and maybe major projects that you've been a part of, those type of aspects. They're all going to ask the same stuff. So have this one pre-prepared. It's like one of those ones that you 100% know they're going to ask in one way or the other, and then try and be able to like basically say it in your sleep without sounding like you're reading from a script. I literally write it up, and I have a bullet point of things that I want to hopefully touch on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Wait, Gordon, before you weasel your way out of this one, what do you think about this question?
Tell me about yourself. Yeah, like Purva said, there's probably 100 different ways this question is asked, and it's typically one of the first questions that comes in the interview. What they're really trying to assess is, one, they want to learn a little bit more about the work that you currently do. So that's the first thing. They want to learn about your understanding of this current position that you're interviewing for. They want to then know how you meet the skills and qualifications for this position. And then they want to know why you're interested in this position now. So those four things, however they ask this question, should be included in your response at a minimum. They're not really asking about your hobbies, your passions, your interests. If you want to be funny or cute, you could throw something there at the end for rapport building if you read the room and it's right, but it should not be the focus of your response for this entire question. So that's what I would say. Doing those four things, you'll get it right.
Yeah, one of the things that I'll just say about this is, one thing that has worked extremely well for me is, of course, you could think about, tell me about yourself before the interview, plan it and everything, which is great. I would do that as well, and I do that. But I think, again, saying it in that non-scripted way, I like telling stories. So I take the interviewers on a journey about why exactly I'm applying for this position, and weaving my experiences through that. And so by the end of that response, they're like, oh wow, like was this person destined to be hired for this position? So the storytelling aspect, I think, is important and helps people stand out.
Yeah, definitely don't make it sound like you're reading off a screen. Like, have some bullet points to make sure you're kind of hitting certain things, like Gordon said, to guide and hit those four things. But make it interesting. This is going to be a first impression in the interview. Show your personality. I think that's always a really nice winner, because you might have like two people who have the same skill set, but if one of them has a personality that kind of fits better, they might pick that person over the other, who probably was way too nervous and stoic.
Again. You are applying for this position. Why are you applying for it? Like, show some passion.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah. And also, don't ramble on. I feel I've done this interviews before where I've asked this question, and sometimes people get too nervous that they just go on and on and on, and there's no real story to it. There's no real purpose for why they're saying the things about them. So I think really be concise, but also, again, show your personality, but be concise in your response. Don't just ramble on, and really get to the point in terms of what you're trying to say and how that will impress the committee.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that's the best way to go. However, I will say, just based on the way how a lot of interviews are scored, rambling on, even though it can be distasteful, can result in you scoring higher. So as long as you're not, it's more about not saying the same thing over and over.
Yeah.
If you happen to have a 10-minute answer where you say different valuable things, be my guest. But don't ramble in terms of saying the same thing you said over and over. Break that cycle, realize, yeah, I've said this 3 times already. I just need to end my answer. Chances are they're still writing down your responses, so you don't have to feel awkward that they're just going to stare at you like that's it. They're going to probably still be writing when you're done. So just know your exit strategy from the question too. One of the things that I've gotten more comfortable with is asking for them to repeat the question.
Yeah.
Just to mentally know.
Tell me about yourself. Can you repeat that?
Can you repeat it in a different way? So yeah.
Can I hear it in another sentence?
That's right. So yeah, there's different ways to go about it. Just all you need to know is that they're not asking. They don't really mean tell me about yourself as a family person necessarily or a friend. They want tell me about yourself in the context of this position.
Yes.
So, I guess people are probably already wondering, if you were to give a time estimate of how long a response would be for this question, what would you give?
Depends on your experience. And it depends on the magnitude of the position. So if you're going for a director position, I don't think you'll get away with a 30-second response and like, yep, see you later. They need some depth in the answers. One thing I've asked too is before I've gone into interviews where I'm like, oh, are you able to tell me approximately how many questions there are? And they'll be like, oh, there's 7. I'm like, okay, there's an hour for the interview. I probably talk for, right?
Damn, that's confident right there.
Yeah.
Tell me how many questions are on that list.
Yeah.
That's hectic.
Right. I just ask. It's fine.
Okay.
So, yeah. All right. So you get through that question. You feel good. You're off to a great start. And then it all gets real now where they're asking you specific things about how you'd perform in the position. One of the common questions that I've seen is around your ability to handle the pressure, your ability to manage multiple tasks and projects at the same time. And this often comes in the form of a question or a scenario-based question, such as, describe a time where you had to manage multiple projects under a tight deadline and how you accomplished that. So, Bindra, what's going through your mind when this question happens? What is the interviewer looking for?
So I think this is actually one of the most common questions, I'd say. And of course, the main thing that they're looking for is how well you are at time management, right? If you're able to handle multiple projects, most likely in the role that you're applying for, you're not just working on one project at once. You're not just doing one task, but you'll be presented with multiple tasks, multiple stakeholders involved in the projects that you're working on, and multiple deadlines. And so they want to be able to see how well you work under pressure, how well you're able to manage multiple projects that are going on, and how you manage your time in a way that if you're put under a tight deadline, like how your personality is in terms of taking that. I think that's a very important thing. If they feel that you are stressed out, like they want to know how you would act in that kind of situation. And I think that shows a lot about how you are. And so I think the most important thing when you're given a question like this is to, of course, give an example. They want to know how this has happened in the past in terms of your career. And if that situation were to happen again, how you would go about it. So I think the first approach I would take to any kind of question that's similar to this is look back in terms of other experiences I've had, think of a good example, and really give specifics to that example. Outline in terms of what exactly that project was, when it happened, what position you were in when it happened, and how you went about solving that issue or that conflict that came about when you were handling multiple projects under a very tight deadline.
So is this one where you could use that STAR approach that you spoke about? So the situation, task, action, result?
Yeah, that approach will really help you outline the different areas that need to be covered in this question. So giving that context and then giving the result of how that happened, and then always linking that result back to this position as well in terms of, hey, this is what happened in the past, but this is how, if it were to happen again in this position, if you could anticipate where this kind of situation could happen in this position, I think that's even a more plus point. They would see that, hey, this person already knows what kind of tasks they're going to be getting in this position and they're prepared for it. I think that shows a lot in terms of how skilled you are for the position too.
And Purva, what goes through your mind with this question, and how have you seen this question be asked in interviews that you've been involved with?
What goes through my mind is usually, Bindra mentioned, like you want to start with that example and things like that. Other ways that it can be asked is they'll give you a specific example. Like they'll set up a story for you. So they'll say, you're coming into work and you have so-and-so projects to do and the deadline is like tomorrow morning. How would you go about planning and planning your day, meeting these deadlines? What would you do? So in that case, it does make it a little bit easier in the sense that you have a, scenario already made for you. In those type of questions, I answer it, say I would ideally do this, make sure I am engaging the right people, always talk about communication, teamwork, stakeholders if you have them for the specific projects. In team-based situations, you're never going to be the only one working on this deadline. You got to work with other people. But also follow it up with an example of where you have been in that situation. So you answer the specific example they're giving you and say, like, I would do this in this scenario, and this is how I'd go about it. This is actually something very similar happened to me in so-and-so position where I had to do this project and this project at the same time with a tight deadline, and show that you've been there and you've gotten past it and you were successful, how you handled it, and then resolved the whole situation. So I think with any question, definitely have examples. If you don't have an example, then you follow up with it. If I were in this, this is what I'd do.
Okay. That's a good tidbit right there. What are the key components of response to this question, LaShawn?
Yeah, so I mean, Purva and Bindra covered a lot there. To add something more nuanced to it, on top of what they already mentioned, I think what I have been doing lately is incorporating more project management into my responses. And at the core of this question, as Bindra mentioned, it's talking about organizational skills, time management, pressure situations. But I want to hone in on kind of that organizational / scheduling part of it, because I think you can approach it in a very logical way that really impresses interviewers. So when we're talking about multiple projects, multiple deadlines, let's break that down to the core. What does that actually mean in terms of what you would be doing? Okay, well, let's define the activities that are at hand. What exactly do you need to do to make that project a success? So let's have a list of those activities as the first step, right? Then what you can do is understand the relationship between those activities. If you need to finish one activity before the other, that is important. That's important knowledge, because then you know you can't do the second activity before the first, right? That will help you schedule your activities when you actually do them and show a logical flow of how you're thinking about things. And then once you find that the precedence of when one activity should occur over another, you could talk about estimating the time durations for those activities. And then you could talk about, with all these activities on the list here, what is the most critical activities that need to be done? And you could start thinking about, can I get all this done in a certain timeline without any delays? So you're really talking about understanding lead times and lag times that are needed to accomplish certain things. And dropping those kind of frameworks when you're talking about these questions really show that you really have put thoughts. It's more than saying, oh, it's on my to-do list, it's on my calendar, but really dissecting the different activities to understand how you're going to actually get the work done.
Yeah, show your toolkits, and that way they can see that you've got this whole array of tools that you're going to be using and not just figuring it out,
Yeah. And then what Purva said, use specific. So you do everything I said, but add those specific details, right? And that's how you get hired. The end.
That's how you get hired.
That's it. Let's end it right there.
At the end of the day, the reason we sort of structured this conversation this way is you can't formulate an effective response without knowing the purpose of the question. So they want to see how you function under pressure. So you have to talk through those pieces. It's also important to touch on the interpersonal, because what's often missed in the answer is, do you talk to your is it something you negotiate with your managers? People kind of talk about a lot of their responses as if they're locked in a room by themselves as the only resource. You need to identify if there's other people in the department that can support conversation with the manager, those types of things, right? So it's also just think beyond yourself whenever you're thinking about responding to these questions. The other thing that I'm glad that LaShawn touched on is not only is the I can work under pressure piece is important, which the question kind of highlights, it's taking that proactive approach. So in your response, I have a general proactive approach to planning my work and creating a schedule. However, in a situation where there's unexpected things that occur, because you want to make it clear too that the reason you're under pressure, it's not because of your ineffectiveness of planning. So you're saying, I have it under control under normal circumstances. However, I appreciate that from time to time, things can emerge with tight timelines. In those scenarios, I would look at what I already had planned to do and what the thing that I'm now having to do, what resources we have available internally, what are the consequences of missing that deadline, right? The impact of changing any schedule. And that's very, very important. So don't lose sight of the purpose of the question. Another common question that we see a lot of times is around interpersonal skills or conflict resolution. And the question can come in the form of, describe a time where you had a recent conflict with an employee or coworker and how you resolved it. So depending on how you want to take this question, it can be a very quick answer, which maybe is not a good thing because they want to see you talk through a potential scenario. Or you can give a more longer, well thought out response that touches on all the pieces that they're expecting. But what specifically are they looking for in a response to this question, LaShawn?
That's a fantastic question. So describe a time where you had a recent conflict with the employee / coworker and how you resolved it. Doesn't this happen all the time in the workplace? Sometimes you get annoyed, people don't do some of the work that they were asked to and they promised to. It could lead to all sorts of conflicts. So what they're really wanting to know is they want to know how you behave in that interpersonal setting, right? How do you interact with your colleagues? And as a proxy, how are you going to interact with the manager that's going to hire you? So it's kind of twofold there. So I think the important thing here is, how are you going to be proactive with your approach? And are you going to consider the team dynamics here? Because very easily you could talk smack to your colleague and be like, you suck, why didn't you do this? I hate you. That's not going to lead to effective team. I could guarantee you that. It's going to lead to a lot of bitterness, blah, 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 right? So what they really want you to talk about is, how would you actually go about solving this issue in a very professional way? One of the things I like to talk about in questions like this is a team charter. Are there rules in place to prevent things like this from happening and escalating? Okay, so what is the conduct? What is the contract? I use contract vaguely, but what is the social environment within your team to handle these sorts of problems? Do you talk it through one-on-one before escalating it to your manager? I would hope so. You don't want to, at the first sign of anything, just go and escalate to your manager or supervisor. You want to be able to talk it through. You want to be able to negotiate with that person and work with them to figure out, why didn't this work get done? Is there anything I can do to help support you? And just talk about how you can essentially solve the problem together, okay? And then part 2 to that is, you want to make sure that you put something in place to make sure that this doesn't happen again. So what's your proactive solution? And Gordon has a huge sign up saying types of conflict. So when we're talking about conflicts, we like to categorize it in 2 ways. The first is relational conflict. And that's what I was saying. Hey, I hate you. I don't like you. I don't like the work you do. You're really attacking the person. And that leads to a lot of negative implications for team building, team camaraderie, and team effectiveness. The second approach is considered even a good type of conflict, and the one you should be having in work environments. That's called task conflict. What does that mean? You're focusing on the task at hand. You're making comments about the task at hand in effort to improve the overall process. So no one really feels attacked. Everyone's having these productive conversations about the specific task to, as a whole, improve the process. And that's where any sort of conflict management should focus on. And that leaves people feeling like they're contributing to something greater rather than attacking each other.
Perfect.
I have a question.
Yes.
Conflict sounds like such a big bad word. And whenever I get asked or like preparing for interviews for this question, it's the one I always have difficulty answering because I'm just like, oh my God, like what type of conflicts are they asking about? Because I hear conflict and I'm like, oh, like relational conflict is the first thing I'm thinking. Yeah. And so if someone is having difficulty thinking of examples, how do you go about kind of preparing for this? Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's not that everyone will have any relational conflict, or if they have task conflicts, say it's with their manager and their manager is just piling on too much work and that's creating conflict. How do you go about speaking about examples?
So I would say, so I'm glad LaShawn, I'll get to your question in a second, Purva. I'm glad LaShawn brought that up because I think I'm a big proponent for contextualizing a question before you respond to it. And much like the question we just talked about with proactively organizing your schedule and then getting into situations where that's not possible, the same applies here for this question with, first of all, not all conflict is bad. In situations where you have task-based conflict, that can lead to overall improvements in the products and services. However, relational conflict can be a little bit more toxic to a work culture, and then specifically hone in on that. I would say everybody's experienced conflict, Purva, but it's maybe not at the scale that people's mind go to when they're asked a question. Yeah. A conflict can just be you think something should be done a certain way and your manager says, no, do it now. Or you believe you need more time to do it and your manager thinks it can be done in a quicker period of time. So that's another example. Another example is you and a coworker have a different approaches for how to address a specific problem. That's a task-based conflict, and that can turn into a relational conflict if you're not able to move past that. So then there's different ways you can sort of think about what conflict looks like and what conflict means to you, but you don't really need to manufacture a big scenario to get extra points for this question. It's about the process. This was the conflict. This is how we mitigated it. My teammate, we sit down, we talked about the goal of this work. We kind of put everything else aside. So that's kind of what they want to see in terms of processing that question.
Well, one quick caveat, sorry.
Yeah.
So I want to just be clear that when we're answering these types of questions, we don't want to get too specific into what was said in your specific experience. Like, oh my God, she cheated with this or that, blah, 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 right? So you want to make sure that you're still handling this in a professional way and not bashing your previous organization or people in that organization.
Right. Or you could speak about it in a more politically correct fashion.
Something to add on to what you already said is sometimes people tend to answer this question by putting it on the other person. So let's say if they had a conflict, they really make it look like the other person, it was all their fault, like they were the ones who messed up and did something bad and kind of put themselves as the person who solved the issue. But I think sometimes it's really important to take accountability. And the conflict may have arose because of both parties, and you may have played a part why that conflict arose. And I think sometimes it shows a lot about an individual when they're answering this question that, hey, like I was a part of the reason that this conflict may have happened, but this is how I went and solved it. I think that's really important to tackle as well, because it shows that you are humble and you're able to take accountability for your actions and you learn from your mistakes, right? I think that's very important.
Great point.
That manifests itself in perhaps another way this question gets asked sometimes is it's sort of like describe a time where you realize your behavior was not helping the situation and how you addressed it. That's sort of another way this question gets asked. So I'm glad that you pointed out the personal responsibility piece of it's not that something was happening and you came in and saved the day. Maybe you were the issue itself, and then highlighting your self-awareness within that is very important.
I really want to emphasize that for this question, doing the whole framework, explaining the situation is important, but always focus on communication. Conflict resolution is about communication, talking about it with the right people, making sure you're going through the process of a one-on-one. And then if it needs to be escalated, talking about it with your manager. communication is so key, and I will outright say that. Like, I will say conflict resolution is bound to happen, but how you communicate and actually resolve is going to make sure that your team stays productive and you have a good relationship going forward. Make those statements because it just showcases your personality at work. It showcases your like mentality of going through conflict resolution, and it also sets the tone for the example you're going to give, for the way that you handled it, and this and that. So always emphasize communication in this question, but I'd say for every question, always talk about communication. But yeah, that's always my 2 cents for this.
You want to hear a pro tip?
No. Not from you.
Well, I'm going to say it anyway. So
okay.
In any question, I think the part that separates a good response from an excellent response is tying in the job posting at the end of all of your questions.
Okay. Yes.
So for the conflict question, it shows that you're very aware of what the position is and the roles and responsibilities are. If you're able to then say at the end of all of that with your real example, how you would do it, you would say, yep, I imagine with this position, talking to all the stakeholders to develop strategic plans can get quite contentious because of differences in opinions and perspectives. Mm-hmm. And I would use those skills that I've developed over time in conflict management, conflict resolution to mitigate those situations. That is where you go from
the cherry on
7
top
out of 10 to like a 9 and 10 out of 10.
So true.
Thank you for listening to the Public Health Insight Podcast, your go-to space for informative conversations, inspiring community action. If you enjoy our podcast, be sure to subscribe and leave us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. See you in the next one.